All right, something I've heard in recent times as well as over the years is people in the typology community will say things like, feeling as a function has nothing to do with emotions. They'll say it has to do with values and ethics, not emotions. I think there's a problem here. First of all, let me just start by saying the field of ethics, philosophical ethics, if anything, what we see there is a lot of high thinking types with inferior feeling using their thinking to rationalize feeling related content. In fact, you'll see a lot of TI DOMs using their introverted thinking, their analytical process, to rationalize FE related stuff. The field of ethics, philosophical ethics, definitely is not an example of pure feeling. If anything, it's a mix of using thinking functions to justify feeling related content. So you could say that there's, kind of a polarization thing going on, a mix of thinking functions and feeling functions coming together and collaborating. But you definitely can't say, feeling functions are ethics. No, ethics, once you get into actual ethics, it's a lot of thinking types using their thinking to rationalize feeling related subject matter. Anyways, got that out of the way. Next point. If we're comparing feeling to thinking, so we have this thing we're calling thinking, and we have this other thing we're calling feeling, and they're on opposite ends of this axis. They're on opposite ends of this spectrum. Okay, so if we're calling something thinking and we are separating from this thing called feeling, we must be talking about something that is quite cold and analytical and mechanical in its approach. And the other end of that spectrum would be something that is coming from a more visceral, emotional root. Because you have to ask yourself, when you're making a distinction between these 2 points, what difference are we getting at? If you just do what the Jungian purists do, where they go, let's say they're trying to tell apart TI from FI. They'll be like, well, they're both subjective and rational. It's like, good luck trying to tell them apart if you just end there. If there is a distinction we're trying to make here, this is on this end of the spectrum and this is on the other end of the spectrum, what's the difference? Well, if we've established that this thing called thinking is more mechanical in its approach, more analytical, more detached, we'll say, more cold, then I think it follows that what is left on the other end of the spectrum is a process of decision-making that, rather than being cold, detached, and mechanical, is instead coming from an emotional root. So even if we're talking about, like I said before, people say, oh, feeling functions, they're about values, not emotions. Where do values come from? At some point, there is an emotional root there. In the case of introverted feeling, perhaps it's more personal, more subjective, personal attitudes towards things. Maybe it's, repulsion or attraction. This is coming from an emotional root. Now, perhaps later you can rationalize it with a thinking function, create some sort of structure that's more mechanical to justify it, but at its root, feeling is a more visceral, emotional response and decision-making process relative to this other thing we're juxtaposing it to called thinking. Because you have to be able to separate them in some way. A distinction has to be made here. Now, in the case of, let's say, extroverted feeling, it's like, sure, now we're talking about more of a interfacing process with an external values matrix, but it still stands that the way in which it is engaging, interfacing with the external values is through a visceral, emotional approach rather than the cold, mechanical, analytical approach of thinking. Because again, we still have to maintain some sort of distinction between feeling and thinking. We can't just say, oh, they're both rational functions. If we're separating them as being opposite ends of the spectrum, and we've established that thinking is more mechanical in its manner of understanding, it follows if we take away mechanics, what we are left with is a more emotional manner of understanding the world, approaching decisions, etc. So even if we're in the case of extroverted feeling, where it is more external rather than personal, the way introverted feeling is, still its manner of interfacing with what we'll call the tribe or the people, the external value matrix, it's approaching it from a more emotional lens. Like if you're an FE lead and you're playing to the crowd, that is a kind of almost, there's an emotional impetus within you to give the people what they want. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you're trying to cause a revolution and you're trying to get people fired up. Again, there is a kind of emotional compass there that is not detached, cold, mechanical the way thinking is. So yeah, when people say, oh, feeling not about emotions, it's about values and ethics, it's like, okay, we've already discussed what's wrong with saying it has to do with ethics, because obviously there's a lot of thinking involved with ethics once you're actually, start structuring things in a mechanical sense. And of course, values, again, okay, we are talking about something coming from an emotional lens, an emotional, visceral way of decision making rather than the cold, mechanical, detached approach of thinking. Anyways, I hope I got something across here. Thank you for watching.